Hey, what's up, everyone? I'm back, and this time I'm going to be looking at Spider-Man Life Story to the 70s. Now, in the previous video that I made about this series, I had said that one of the good things that I really liked about the 60s, which is Life Story 1, was I liked how Chip Zdarsky is kind of paralleling things from that era with what's going on with Spider-Man, and I like that everything is kind of happening in real time. You see that Spider-Man is going to be aging, so it's no different here in Life Story 2 in that sense, where it starts off kind of where the other one somewhat left off, but we see Peter here is in the cemetery with his now wife, Gwen Stacy, and the whole thing that's going on here is he is talking with her, and he's showing a little bit of remorse, a little bit of regret over not going to Vietnam, and that's because of the death of his friend, Eugene Flash Thompson. And we see that now Peter is at a point where he's putting that scientific brain of his to good use as part of the Future Foundation with Reed Richards, and of all people, his old enemy, Doc Ock. So that's pretty cool, the way this is all kind of unfolding. And as we see here, Harry at this point has taken over Oscorp, and he seems to be doing well, seems to be making Norman proud. Norman's still in jail, but you can see one thing that is kind of maintaining the true character of Norman Osborn here, and that is the fact that he's still manipulating Harry. And he's, just kind of telling him the things he expects here. And at this point, we go a little bit further. Gwen is also working and putting her scientific brain to use. I like the costume that they did here for Spider-Man. The artwork in this is great, by the way. Mark Bagley, I think, was the perfect choice for this series to work with Chip Zdarsky. I think he really kind of conveys the right emotion that these characters are needing, and kind of he has that kind of semi old school and semi. It's like, how would I describe it? I would say he knows how to make it feel old school, but not have to draw on that, just not have to draw in that antiquated style. So it's nothing like, for example, like Ed Piskor, who draws in this kind of older style that fits X-Men Grand Design. This is more of just being able to convey more of that old-time feel, but in a modern way, if that makes sense. Anyways, that's besides the point. He goes to visit Mary Jane and Harry Osborn, and one thing that is very interesting here in this interaction with Mary Jane, and another thing that's true to the comics from the 70s, Harry he's pretty much on drugs and alcohol, and he's passed out by the time Peter comes to see him. But what's interesting about this interaction with Mary Jane is that Mary Jane has known for a while now that he is Spider-Man, and she kind of grills him a little bit here over not saving Flash and not going to Vietnam as well, which is interesting because it's a sentiment that Peter has from the very first issue of Life Story, where he feels, he got to use his great power, because, with great power comes great responsibility, and she just kind of just rubs more salt in that wound, and it's just like, you're a coward. You should have gone. You should have, maybe our friend Flash Thompson would still be alive had you gone. So it's interesting because she's shaming him for what she perceives to be his complacency in the situation. So I thought that was very interesting. It is kind of, it echoes the sentiment that Peter already kind of feels. So they're kind of, in a way, in agreement on this, although Peter doesn't necessarily say that here. So I like that's kind of acknowledged here, that there's things that Mary Jane and Peter both have in common that they feel very strongly about. So, of course, this has an effect on him, as you see here, and he lashes out at Reed over the frustration, but he's kind of looking for an out anyways, because he's been thinking about leaving Reed's Future Foundation for a little bit here, and this is just kind of the final nail here, this interaction that they have, because he hits Reed with a low blow here. He basically tells Reed, like, this is, you push people away. This is why Sue went away and married Namor, which is another thing that's very interesting, because if you know about the older comics, Namor always had this interest. As a matter of fact, when he first reappeared in the 60s, Namor, I believe, had kidnapped Sue Storm in order to make her queen of Atlantis. So he's always had somewhat of a romantic interest in her. And there was a what if, I believe, back in the 90s, what if Namor had joined the Fantastic Four. And if I recall correctly, in that particular issue, what ended up happening was he did end up marrying Sue Storm. So that kind of comes to life here as well, or that kind of happened here in this universe as well. She ended up marrying Namor and leaving Reed Richards. So we see the interaction with Mary Jane and Harry here. But let's skip on ahead here because I don't want to get too much into this. Oh, there's another thing I really liked too, was the fact that instead of just giving Harry the mantle of Green Goblin, the hand-me-down mantle of being the second Green Goblin, he gets kind of his own identity in this, and that's the Black Goblin with a little bit of a different look. I really like it. It's a little bit more menacing. So he kind of comes into his own as his own Goblin, which I like better than just rehashing him as the Green Goblin. But what ends up happening here is something that, of course, was retconned later on, and that's the fact that Norman Osborn had commissioned this guy to make clones. He makes a clone of Norman Osborn himself, Gwen Stacy, and Peter Parker. And of course, the reason for that was, or we come to find out, is because the clone for Norman Osborn obviously is for him to be able to pin his crimes on and for him to be able to be free. So his clone would basically be suffering in jail while he's out free and about. So the reason for the Peter clone, at least the way Harry perceives it, is for Peter to end up being his heir. Because even though he hates Peter, there's respect there, and he knows that Peter, despite his hatred for Peter, Peter was ideally the kind of son that Norman Osborn always wanted, that would kind of take after him in the sense of having the scientific brain and really having his stuff together. Whereas, of course, Harry was always self-conscious because he felt like a failure, and Norman never did anything to really encourage him or reinforce any positive values or any kind of positive reinforcement within him. But what's interesting about this whole thing here is, after finding out about these clones, they're of course destroyed, and what ends up happening, or what you end up finding out, and spoiler coming here, is that the supposed clone of Gwen Stacy is actually not a clone at all. It's actually the real Gwen Stacy. So in a way, kind of by indirectly, it's interesting the way they make it that Norman Osborn is kind of responsible for Gwen Stacy's death, though not directly, kind of indirectly. He's responsible for Gwen Stacy's death yet again. And this clone that Peter has been married to, she has to come to terms with the fact that she's a clone. And of course, the Peter Parker clone and her end up leaving about a year later. And basically wanting to start their own life together and just kind of forget the fact that they were clones and just kind of move on with things. And the only person really left in Peter's life at this point, because now he's in a dark place because he's pretty much in shambles. The person that he thought, obviously he finds out one of his good friends is dead. His best friend is, a psycho new villain of his, really working on behalf of his greatest enemy, who's Norman Osborn, his father, his best friend's father, and the woman that he loved, his wife, or that he thought was his wife, was not actually his wife, was actually a clone, and his real wife is dead now. So he's pretty much left in shambles. And on top of that, because he left the Future Foundation, he's out of work. So, he didn't leave, he got fired. So he's in this really dark place now. He's got nothing really left, and the only person that seems to still be around in his life pretty actively is, he still has his Aunt May somewhere off, but the only person that's still around, that's still a friend of his and is still around, is Mary Jane, because Harry, after the whole incident with the clones and all that stuff, he ends up leaving. So because of that, everything that Harry had, Mary Jane inherits. So she's well-to-do, but Peter is jobless, he's wifeless, and he's just in a bad place. And that's where this kind of ends, is just with Mary Jane really being the only person left in his broken life at this point. So I'm not going to show the end because obvious reasons once again, but this was really good. I like the way that they incorporated, or the way that Chip Zdarsky incorporated things that are part of Spider-Man's lore that have been also retconned in later years, incorporating it in a different way, in kind of the order that it would have happened, right? So he's doing a great job of that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where it goes into the 80s, because the 80s is an interesting time for Spider-Man 2, as we know, because the 80s is where we get Kraven's Last Hunt, which is one of the best Spider-Man stories of the 80s, as well as the rise of Venom in the 80s. So looking forward to seeing if that's what's included in the 80s issue of Spider-Man Life Story. But this one is good. Again, this series is one that, to me at least, it's gradually getting better. So that's the best thing you could hope for with a series like this. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Until next time, you all know how it goes. The hunt continues.